Imagine this. A loaf of bread costs $200 million in the morning, $500 million at noon, and $2 billion in the evening. A teacher rented a truck to collect his salary. Banknotes were cheaper than toilet paper. Yes, these are real. In Zimbabwe, people were poor despite having trillions. This event was the most horrific economic collapse in modern history. And no one could stop it. Dar Undergang des Paradises, Jar 2008. Every empire swears by the security of its currency. Every government insists that its promises will last forever, but history proves them wrong every time. But no story has been as fast, ruthless, and absurd as that of Zimbabwe. Because in Zimbabwe, money lost value so rapidly that people had to transport their salaries by truck. And in the end, trillions were thrown into the trash. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, it was the shining star of Africa. It was called Africa's Diamond. It had fertile land, modern agricultural systems, and an educated population. The Zimbabwean dollar was more valuable than the US dollar. Yes, you heard that right. One Zimbabwe dollar was equal to 1.47 US dollars. The country was rich, stable, and full of hope. Robert Mugabe came to power as an independence hero. In the early years, he was a reasonable leader. The economy grew, infrastructure developed, and the white minority and black majority lived together. But in the late 1992, everything began to change because Mugabe lived in fear of losing power, and this fear ruined the country. I'm sure some countries are experiencing the same problems right now. I can read your mind. In 2000, Mugabe made a radical decision. The Rapid Land Reform Program. The land of white farmers left over from the colonial era would be seized. The goal was to bring justice to landless black citizens. It sounded noble, but the implementation was disastrous. Zimbabwean farmers possessed Zimbabwe's agricultural knowledge. They had worked these lands for generations. They had modern irrigation systems, seed technologies, and market connections. And overnight, they were evicted from their fields. The land was mostly given to politicians close to Mugabe and inexperienced individuals. The result? Agricultural production collapsed. Zimbabwe went from being Africa's diamond to a country importing bread. Tobacco production fell by 60%. Corn production dropped by 70%. Exports stopped. There was no foreign exchange left, and the economy went into freefall. In 2003, the first serious signs of inflation appeared. 600%. The government panicked because the treasury was empty. There was no income, but spending continued. Mugabe's solution was simple: print more money. Gideon Gono, the head of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, will go down in history as one of the most dangerous central bankers ever, because Gono believed that the value of money could be preserved by printing it without limit. We print money, the economy grows, he said. History had heard this phrase hundreds of times, and each time, disaster followed. In 2004, inflation hit 133%. In 2005, it was 585%. In 2006, it reached 281%. It was now out of control. Prices changed daily. Shop owners would set prices in the morning, relabel them in the afternoon, and change them again in the evening, because the value of money was evaporating within hours. People were in shock. A teacher's monthly salary was 50 million Zimbabwe dollars, but with that money, they could only buy 3 loaves of bread. A month's work for 3 loaves of bread. Pensioners were worse off. Their pensions didn't even cover a bus ticket. At the end of 2007, the government found a new solution, removing the zeros. 10 million Zimbabwean dollars became equal to the new $1. This process, called redenomination, did not solve the problem. It only delayed it, because the real problem was not the number of zeros. The problem was the government's unstoppable printing of money. By the time 2008 rolled around, the situation had turned into a nightmare. inflation had reached 231 million%, but the real figure was much higher. Because the government had stopped releasing figures, an economist named Steve Hanke tried to calculate the real inflation rate. The result was terrifying: 79.6 billion% per month. That's 98% daily. In other words, every day, the value of money was halved. People were now carrying their salaries in sacks, wheelbarrows, backpacks, suitcases, because millions, billions, trillions took up too much space to carry by hand. One woman brought 3 sacks of money to pay her hospital bill. The nurses had given up counting. They measured it with scales. 5 kilos of money was the price of 1 service. Banknotes were flying in the streets. The wind carried them away. No one bent down to pick them up because they were worthless. Children made toys out of banknotes. Paper airplanes play money. Real money had turned into toys. The most cruel aspect of hyperinflation was the instant evaporation of savings. The money you saved your whole life was worthless when you woke up one morning. Pensioners were driven to suicide. The middle class disappeared. Everyone became poor, those with money and those without. And the government was still printing money because it had no other choice. Money was printed to cover the budget deficit, to pay salaries, to feed the army. And every time they printed it, it was like pouring gasoline on the fire. The fire grew even bigger. In mid-2008, the Reserve Bank printed $100 billion bills, then 1 trillion, then 10 trillion. And finally, in July 2008, the largest banknote in history was printed, 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars. Now think about it, 100 trillion, a number with 14 zeros. It was the world's largest banknote. But what was its purchasing power? 3 eggs, or half a loaf of bread. The trillion had become a joke. Mugabe continued to blame others, the West, sanctions, white farmers, the IMF, but the truth was plain for all to see. The government was destroying its own citizens. By printing money, it was committing systemic robbery, because inflation is an invisible tax. It transfers money from the people's pockets into the government's coffers. And in Zimbabwe, this robbery was happening at the speed of light. In November 2008, inflation peaked. According to economist Hanke's calculations, 89.7 sextillion%, 89 sextillion, 700 quintillion%, a number beyond human comprehension. Money had lost all meaning. Hyperinflation isn't just about numbers, it's about how it ruins people's lives. And in Zimbabwe, every day was a battle for survival. 6 a.m. The alarm goes off, but you're already awake because you know that if you go to the market late, the prices will change. You don't have time for breakfast. You head out with the money you have, because going out without money means going to your death. 7 a.m. You rush into the market as soon as it opens. You look at the price of bread, $500 million. Yesterday, it was $300 million. Tomorrow, it might be $1 billion. You grab it quickly, because waiting until noon means paying more. But there's a problem. There are 15 people in line at the register, and everyone is counting bags full of cash. The cashiers can't count it with machines because the machines can't handle that many bills. They're counting by hand, and you wait. The value of your money is dropping every minute. Your pocket is losing value. When it's your turn, you take money out of your bag or sack. You ask the cashier, is 500 million still valid? The cashier looks at the board. No, now it's 600 million, they say. You add another 100 million. But you don't have that much in your pocket. You're short. You can't buy bread. This was the daily reality for millions of people in Zimbabwe. Money has ceased to be a store value. It was just a burden you had to move very quickly. The moment you got your salary, you had to spend it immediately, because tomorrow that money would be worthless. Workers began demanding their wages twice a day from employers, half before starting work in the morning, the other half during the lunch break, because getting it in the evening meant losing value. Employers had to accept this. Otherwise, no one would work. Banks descended into chaos. People couldn't withdraw money from their accounts because banks couldn't print enough physical cash. ATMs set a daily limit every morning, a maximum of 100 million withdrawals per day. But 100 million wasn't enough for a loaf of bread. So people lined up. They waited for hours, sometimes days, in ATM lines, just to withdraw a little cash. Because without cash, you couldn't do anything in the economy. Credit cards didn't work, electronic payments had collapsed, only cash, and there was no cash. The Reserve Bank found a solution: larger banknotes. Throughout 2008, banknotes of ever-increasing values were printed. 10 million, 100 million, 1 billion, 100 billion, 100 trillion. 12 different zeros were added within a year. But that didn't solve it either, because prices were rising faster. When 100 trillion was printed, bread was already 200 trillion. The banknotes lagged behind inflation. People started looking for alternatives: dollars, South African rand, Botswana, pula. Foreign currencies were more valuable than the Zimbabwe dollar. Markets started displaying two price tags: Zimbabwe dollar and US dollar. If you paid in dollars, the price was fixed. If you paid in Zimbabwe dollars, the price changed hourly. But dollars were hard to come by. Currency was traded on the black market, on street corners, in secret houses. People traded dollars. The government had banned it. Possessing dollars was a crime. But everyone did it because they had to survive. Borders became trade routes. Going to South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique to bring back goods was the way to survive. People left the country in trucks, bringing back basic foodstuffs, medicine, fuel, and they sold these in Zimbabwe. But of course, not with Zimbabwean dollars, with dollars or through barter. The barter economy returned. History had gone back 3,000 years. When money became useless, people started exchanging goods. My chicken for your rice, my fuel for your bread. It was primitive, but it worked. It was more reliable than money. The healthcare system collapsed. Hospitals lost their doctors and nurses. Because salaries were worthless, doctors fled the country. They emigrated to South Africa, Botswana, England. Those who remained started working for dollars. When you went to the hospital, they said, bring $10 in cash, or no treatment. The education system collapsed. Teachers stopped going to work. Their salaries didn't cover the fuel needed to commute to school. Schools closed. A generation was deprived of education. Power outages reached 18 hours a day. The government couldn't pay the electricity company. It couldn't find fuel. The generators were useless. The country was plunged into darkness. Crime exploded. Desperation increased robberies. But even the robberies were absurd. Bandits would steal sacks full of cash, then realize that the money they stole wouldn't buy anything tomorrow. So they started stealing goods: food, fuel, dollars, real valuable things. Mugabe's regime drew strength from chaos. Because chaos silenced the opposition, people were focused more on survival than political struggle. Even when protests occurred, the police struggled to suppress them. Political rivals were imprisoned and tortured, and Mugabe controversially won the 2008 elections. But the economy was truly dying. By the end of 2008, the Zimbabwean dollar had no value left. People had even stopped using it. Banknotes were littering the streets. They were being thrown away. Children playing in the park used banknotes to play soccer. Money was trash. January 2009. The Zimbabwean government announced a historic decision. The Zimbabwean dollar was officially dead. The country was switching to a multi-currency system. The US dollar, South African rand, Botswana, pula, pound sterling, and euro all became legal tender. It was a defeat. A government admitting that its own currency had collapsed, but it had no choice because the economy had already abandoned the Zimbabwean dollar. The government had no option but to accept reality. And something surprising happened. The economy began to recover. inflation stopped immediately because the central bank could no longer print money. Foreign currencies were being saved because they were valuable. Prices stabilized, goods arrived in the markets, people breathed a sigh of relief. But the damage was horrific. Zimbabwe's economy had shrunk by 50%. The middle class had disappeared. Millions of people had fled the country. An estimated 3 to 4 million Zimbabweans were living in South Africa and Botswana. The brain drain had emptied the country. Old savings had completely evaporated. The money you had saved your whole life was worth nothing. You had $100 trillion in the bank, but it was worthless. Pensioners died of starvation. Families were destroyed. Suicides, disease, migration, a complete social catastrophe. Mugabe? He remained in power until 2017. He was overthrown by a military coup, but those who replaced him were from the same party. ZANU-PF is still in power. And in 2019, Zimbabwe entered another inflationary spiral. They printed a new currency, the Zimbabwe RTGS dollar, and the same mistake is being repeated. Because no lessons were learned. The problem wasn't Mugabe. The problem was the system. The government's unlimited power to print money is always abused. Politicians sacrifice the economy for short-term gains, and the people pay the price. Zimbabwe's story is not just the collapse of an African country. It is a modern version of a recurring lesson in history. Weimar Germany in 1923, Hungary in 1946, Argentina in 1989, Venezuela today, and Turkey are rapidly heading in this direction. It's all the same spiral. The government borrows, prints money, inflation rises, prints more money to solve the problem, inflation rises further. The end result is death. People ask, how does hyperinflation occur? The answer is simple. When the government prints more money than is produced, the money supply increases, but the amount of goods remains the same or decreases. Demand is high, supply is low, prices rise. The government tries to control prices, but it fails. The black market flourishes. Then the government spends more, prints more money, and the spiral accelerates. What is the outcome? Either the government stops printing money or the currency completely loses value. There are two options, painful reform or total collapse. Zimbabwe went through total collapse first, then forced reform. So who won? No one. The people lost, pensioners lost, workers lost, entrepreneurs lost. The only winners were those with foreign assets, those who saved in dollars, those who bought property abroad, those who owned gold, silver, foreign currency. And here, history teaches us the same lesson again. Don't trust the government's money. When inflation hits, paper burns. Real value is stored in gold, property, production skills, and foreign currencies. Zimbabwe's $100 trillion bills are now sold as collectibles on eBay for $5 to $10. It's a joke. Once printed in trillions, now sold for $5. History's greatest irony. But the real lesson is this. This is not just Africa's problem. America printed trillions in 2008 and 2020. Europe printed billions through QE. Turkey is struggling with inflation. Venezuela is in collapse. Lebanon's banks have closed. History repeats itself everywhere. Zimbabwe is a warning. The collapse of money is not a distant fantasy. It is a real risk. Governments always do the same thing in a crisis. They print money. And every time they do, it devalues the money in your pocket. The way to protect yourself? Real assets, currency diversification, skills, and most importantly, knowledge of history. Because history repeats itself and the next Zimbabwe may be much closer than you think. A $100 trillion bill is a warning. It says, don't trust the government's money. It says, unlimited printing leads to unlimited collapse. And if you don't listen, one morning you'll wake up with your pockets full of cash but unable to buy anything. If this has given you a new perspective, subscribe to my channel. Remember, history holds the answers. I'll just show you where to look.